Hello, and welcome to Revelations in Grace. I'm John Paul, and today we're going to be discussing the end of the millennium. In the previous video, we talked about how Jesus was resurrected with many martyrs in Matthew 27, and I indicated that this began the first resurrection that Revelation 20 talks about that started the millennium. And these saints and Jesus ascended into heaven together and began their supreme reign. If the millennium began then, when was it going to end? Revelation is a book written full of symbols, and this is indicated in the very first verse. It reads, "A revelation of Jesus Christ that God gave him to show to his servants what things must quickly come to pass. And he signified it." That means he communicated it in symbols. He signified it, having sent through his messenger to his servant John. And this becomes apparent throughout the rest of Revelation. For instance, John sees a picture of a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. That's what he actually sees. But later in chapter 17, the angel tells John, "The beast that you saw represents 7 kings rested on 7 hills, and the horns on their head represents 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom." So even though John is seeing a beast, this beast symbolized an empire, and it symbolized 7 kings of that empire. So we have the angel himself, the inspired angel, speaking on behalf of God, telling John to interpret what he's seeing as symbols. Well, rightfully so, the millennium is another such symbol, and it should be interpreted that way. And the video I'm doing today is going to be separated into 2 parts. We're going to be discussing the timing when the millennium was expected to end, and we're going to be discussing its symbolic meaning. And that will be discussed in the next video. We'll be covering how the first century Christians and Jews believed that the world was divided into 7 figurative millennia, and Christ's reign would be the 6th millennia, and it was going to last much shorter than an actual 1,000 years, even 40 years. And we're going to discuss some of the scriptures behind that. So if you have questions about how the millennium could be a shorter period, stay tuned and we'll discuss that. But today, we're going to be discussing the millennium's timing. Now, the millennium begins with 4 prominent events, or not begins, it ends with 4 prominent events. You have the Great White Throne Judgment. You have the resurrection of the dead, and it's the only resurrection to include both the righteous and the wicked. You have the extinction of Satan and Hades in the lake of fire, and you have the establishment of the New Jerusalem in the kingdom of heaven, and that's talked about in the following chapter. And I'm looking at Revelation 20 here, and you can see here, we have the Great White Throne Judgment, the resurrection of the dead. We have the defeat of death and Hades. We have Satan being cast into the lake of fire. And in the following chapter, we have the New Jerusalem, the holy city. So these are the major 4 events at the end of the millennium, and they were all closely associated with each other. The dead had to be resurrected before experiencing their judgment, and the judgment had to be delivered before they could go to heaven. And heaven, the New Jerusalem, was going to be open to them at this time when Satan and Hades were defeated, when death and Hades and Satan were defeated. Well, all of these events, even though the Bible doesn't describe the millennium anywhere else in Scripture, it does frequently talk about these 4 events. And without fail, all 4 of them were constantly promised to happen soon. And that means, since these events only happen once, that means the end of the millennium was also expected to happen soon. So let's dive in and start looking at some of the promises about how these events were going to happen soon. Well, one prominent belief is that Christ is going to return in multiple stages. He's going to have multiple returns to dish out different judgments to different types of people. However, in every instance where Christ returns, he's recorded to be establishing the kingdom of heaven. And this kingdom of heaven was only going to be established once, and it would remain forever. In Daniel 7, it talks about how the Son of Man was coming in the clouds of the sky, and he was coming to the Ancient of Days, that is God. And at that point, dominion was given to him, and he was given an everlasting kingdom which would never fade away. And this is recording Christ's return to God. Now, if you remember in John 14, Jesus said, I'm going to my Father's house to prepare you rooms. And when I come again, I will take you to myself and bring you back to my Father's house, to the rooms I've prepared for you. And this meant that Jesus was going to return and resurrect the saints, and then he was going to bring the saints to God. And I believe this depicts that. This is Jesus returning to God in heaven with the saints with him. And at that point, he's given a kingdom. Now, earlier in Daniel, in chapter 2, verse 44, he talks about how this kingdom would never be destroyed. It would be set up once, and it would stand forever. Well, if a kingdom is set up once and it stands forever, it's not going to be recreated multiple times. In every instance where Jesus is promising to return, that also records the establishment of the kingdom. For instance, in Matthew 16, verses 27 through 28, I'm reading in the Weymouth New Testament translation. It says, "For the Son of Man is soon to come." That word soon, that's in the Greek, that's mello. "In the glory of his Father with his angels. And then he will requite every man according to his actions. I solemnly tell you that some of those who are standing here will certainly not taste death till they have seen the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So there we have an indication that Jesus was going to establish his kingdom when he came. That's that same kingdom prophesied in Daniel. Well, Revelation 22, the very last chapter in Revelation, this is after the great white throne judgment, and this is after the New Jerusalem. Jesus says, "Behold, I am coming quickly. My reward is with me to repay each man according to his work." And then he goes on to say how those who obey him and listen to him, the saints, they will enter by the gates into the city. He's referring back to the New Jerusalem that was established a couple chapters prior. Remember here where he says the holy city, the New Jerusalem, that was coming down after the great white throne judgment, or with the great white throne judgment. And when Jesus came quickly, he would allow them into that city. So both instances, the great white throne judgment and Matthew 16, indicate a near return, and it indicates Jesus establishing the kingdom of heaven, which was an event that would happen at the great white throne judgment. Well, also 2 Timothy 4:1 indicates that Jesus was going to return soon to establish his kingdom. It talks, and in the Greek, you'll find the word mello. It's not included in the ESV translation, but it is in the literal versions and in the Greek. And it says Jesus is about to judge the living and the dead, and he's going to appear with his kingdom. And this idea is that Jesus is coming again in his kingdom. Well, actually, Matthew 25 also indicates that when Jesus returned, he would come in his kingdom. And this is important because Matthew 25 includes the sheep and the goats judgment. But first, it starts with a parable. It talks about how the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. And Jesus talks about when he returns. This is a parable about his return. He's talking about the importance of watching for his return. And he was going to return. And while some of the the virgins were busy, preoccupied buying oil for their lamps, the rest had prepared themselves. And when Jesus returned, he was going to take them into the wedding feast, a metaphor for the kingdom of heaven. And the virgins who weren't ready for his return were going to be locked out of the kingdom. The door was going to be shut behind them. But this was a picture that when Jesus returned, he was going to establish the kingdom of heaven. And he uses this to instruct his disciples to watch and pay attention. Well, several verses later, in the same context, he talks about how he's going to come and judge the living and the dead, the sheep and the goats. He says the Son of Man is going to come in glory. And he judges the goats with the lake of fire. And he tells the sheep, "Come and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Now, this passage doesn't mention the word mello. It doesn't include the word soon. However, its parallel passage, Luke 21, does. This is in the same context as the Olivet Discourse. Now, Matthew 25, if you recall, is the chapter right after the Olivet Discourse. In the Olivet Discourse, he's talking about how his generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And he instructs them on the importance of watching for his return, just like Noah watched for the floods, and that he's going to come. And there's no interruption here. There's no ending here. And recall that the Bible didn't have separated verses and chapters the way we do now. And he continues talking into this new context, or into the same context as before. So he's not introducing a new period or a new thought here. This is all part of the same discourse. Well, Luke says the same subject, but more briefly. He talks about how when Jesus comes on the cloud and they see him, that's when they were to know that at that point the kingdom of heaven is near. That's when the kingdom of heaven would arrive, when Jesus was seen coming on the clouds. And he told them to always be on the watch, just like Matthew 24 and 25 did. And he tells them to pray that they may be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that they may be able to stand before the Son of Man. So this word is in the Greek, melo, about to. And he's saying that the events, the same events that the parallel passage records of the sheep and goats judgment, that was about to happen. And they should pray that they would be able to stand before the Son of Man. So this is really powerful because even this passage is indirectly indicated to occur soon. And it was also the time of the establishment of the kingdom. So that's pretty cool. Well, this kingdom was frequently stated to occur soon. In Matthew 3:2, it talks about how the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And this is restated in chapter 4. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And in Matthew 10, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And in Mark 1, repent and believe in the good news because the time is fulfilled and God's kingdom is at hand. And in Luke 10, he says, God's kingdom has come near to you, but in whatever city you enter, and they don't receive you, go into the streets and say, even the dust from your city that clings to us, we wipe off against you. Nevertheless, know this, that God's kingdom has come near to you. So frequently throughout the Bible, it was promised that God's kingdom was about to come. And throughout the Gospels, there was a strong expectation of this heavenly kingdom, this new Jerusalem arriving. And in the David Bentley Hart's translation in Hebrews 13:14, it says, for here we have no abiding city, but instead seek the one about to come. He's talking about the heavenly Jerusalem there. And here in the Julia Smith translation, in Hebrews 13, it says the same thing. She translates it with that word melo, the way it should be translated. For here we have no abiding city, but we seek that about to be. And she's talking about the heavenly Jerusalem. It says it right here in the previous chapter. But you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. So this is talking about the heavenly Jerusalem, that same new Jerusalem that's descending out of heaven in Revelation 21 after the great white throne judgment. That was about to happen. They were about to experience that. And when they did, they would be welcomed there at Christ's return. So that is pretty cool. Christ's return didn't just establish the kingdom of heaven, it also initiated the second resurrection. There are several verses that indicate that when Jesus returned, the dead would be resurrected. And that was going to happen on the last day. And John talks about that in chapter 6 and in chapter 11. Well, in Matthew 13 and in Revelation 14, the resurrection of the dead is compared to a harvest. And I'm going to be covering this topic briefly because I mentioned it in the previous video and in the video about the resurrection. But just like God commanded the tithing of the first fruits in Leviticus 23, so there were going to be two resurrections, the first fruits and then the remaining harvest. And in the previous video, we discussed how Hosea 6 describes these two resurrections, and so does John 5 and Revelation 20. And we also talked about how Christ was referred to as the first fruits in several passages. And the first resurrection was only of the martyrs, those tortured to receive a better resurrection in Hebrews 11:35. If you read in the Berean Standard Bible, the author of Hebrews is talking about how the saints in the Old Covenant, they were tortured and refused their release so that they might gain a better resurrection. I believe that's an indication of the first resurrection. It included those who were killed for the word of God. That's described in Revelation 6. And it included those who were beheaded for their testimony of Christ in Revelation 20. Therefore, the remainder of the dead included the saints who weren't martyred, and it included the wicked dead. And that was going to come when Christ returned. And this resurrection of the wicked dead was about to happen. And this is so powerful, but in Acts 24:15, it says, having a hope in God, which they themselves also await, that there is about to be a resurrection, both of the just, and catch this, and of the unjust. This is powerful because there's only one resurrection that includes the wicked dead, and that's at the end of the millennium. And Paul is saying that this is about to happen. The unjust are about to be resurrected. That is super powerful. And this resurrection was about to happen in 2 Timothy 4:1. In the Berean Literal Bible, it says, I earnestly declare before God and Christ Jesus, the one being about to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom. So Jesus was going to come in his kingdom. He was going to judge the living and the dead, and that was about to happen. And again, you can verify in the Greek that that word about to should be there, right here, melantos. And that's also true with Acts 24:15, if you want me to verify that there is about to be, and that's melein, which also means about to. Peter 4 uses an even stronger word to indicate that this resurrection was about to happen. He talks about these wicked people, and they're giving the Christians a hard time for not joining in their same excess. And Peter says they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So God was about to judge the living and the dead. Jesus was about to do this. And a couple verses later, he says, but the end of all things is near. And he tells them to be prepared and to pray, like they need to be prepared for this happening to their generation. And he says that the end of all things is near. Well, what end is he talking about? All things. And that especially includes the judgment of the living and the dead, which was, he mentioned just 2 verses earlier. And it wasn't just of the righteous, it was of the wicked. These Gentiles who were walking in lewdness, lust, drunken binges, orgies, carousing, they were about to give account to him who was ready to judge the living and the dead. And this word is near. The end of all things is near. That's an even stronger word than mellow. It means it's so close you can even taste it. And there's really no dispute about that word. That definitely means something was near to happening. So yeah, repeatedly, the second resurrection was promised to occur soon when Jesus returned, and that would initiate the second resurrection. Well, at the time of the second resurrection, heaven would become accessible to saints forevermore, and that's indicated again in the Great White Throne Judgment at the end of Revelation. But Hebrews 9 explains that this new Jerusalem, or holy place, in heaven would become accessible at the fall of the old Jerusalem and its temple, completing the transition from the old to the new covenant. In Hebrews 9, verse 8, it says, by this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places, and here he's talking about heaven, is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, the first section of the temple, the Jewish temple. So as long as that Jewish temple section was still standing, it indicated that the way into heaven was not yet opened. And he says this is a symbol for the present age. So the Christians at that time were in the Old Covenant age. There was a period of time where both covenants were in effect at the same time. The new covenant had come into effect at the cross, and the old covenant was fading away and would disappear at the destruction of the temple. And during that time, Christians were technically under the new covenant, but they still practiced some of the old covenant laws in order to keep their ministry from being offensive to the Jews, so that they could save as many people as possible. Well, this time was coming to an end, and when that temple did fall, that's when the saints would be allowed into heaven. And we see that he's talking about heaven because a few verses later, he talks about how Christ hasn't entered the holy place made with hands, but the ones not made with hands, in heaven itself. And this is also evidenced in the previous chapter, where he talks about Christ as a minister in the true holy places, the true tent that the Lord set up in the majesty in heaven. So this was in heaven. And the idea of the transition between the covenants is spoken in verse 13, where the author of Hebrews says, and speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. That old covenant was ready to vanish away. Well, this prophecy is actually in line with Daniel 12 and Revelation 11. These are both prophecies of the second resurrection, and they would occur when the temple fell. This is so powerful. In Daniel 12, and first I want to put this in context. Daniel 11, the previous chapter, is a recording of historical events from the Persian Empire to the takeover of Greece, then how Greece was divided into the four kingdoms, and then you have frequent battles between the king of the south, Ptolemaeus, and the king of the north. I don't remember how to pronounce the name. It's like Seleucides or something like that. I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong. But it includes some of the marriages between those kingdoms, and it discusses the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes and how he caused an abomination of desecration and attacked the Jews like about 100 years or more before Christ came. And that was also prophesied in Daniel 8. And then it goes on to talk about Caesar Augustus and the rise of the Roman Empire. And then it talks about some of his battles with Egypt. And at the end, in the last couple verses, it talks about Nero Caesar, how he was disturbed by reports from the east with Israel, and he went out to make war against Israel, and he planted his tents. His armies went and encamped between Israel and the sea, and at that point Nero died. And although Nero wasn't actually in those tents when he died, he had set up those tents before he died, and they were set up when he died in Rome. Well, that's the context for Hebrews 12. So it discusses how Nero had planted his tents outside of Jerusalem, and then we get into chapter 12. And in chapter 12, the angel tells John, "At that time, Michael will stand up, the great prince who stands for the children of your people. And there will be a time of trouble, a time of great distress, such as never has been since there was a nation even to that same time. At that time, your people will be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book." He's talking about the book of life. "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." So this is talking about the second resurrection because it includes the wicked dead, those rising to shame and everlasting contempt. And a few verses later, Daniel overhears a conversation between two angels, and one of them asks, "How long will it be until the end of these things?" He says it right here in verse 6. "How long will it be to the end of these wonders?" And the angel replies, "It will be for a time, times, and a half," which time there refers to a year. So this is talking about 1 year, 2 years, and half a year, or that is, when you add them together, 3.5 years. "And it will end when they have finished breaking into pieces the power of the holy people." That's when all of these things will be finished, including the second resurrection. Well, in Daniel 9, we learn what that means. Because in Daniel 9, he makes this prophecy about how Jesus would die, and then there would be the people of the prince who will destroy the city and the sanctuary, the destruction of the Jewish temple. Its end will be with a flood, and war will be even to the end. Desolations are determined. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, which a week is 7 years. And so half of 7 years is 3.5. That's 3.5 years. In the middle of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and the offering to cease. Take note of that. On the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, and even to the full end, and that determined wrath will be poured out on the desolate. So there was going to be abomination of desolation. He was going to cause the sacrifice to cease. And this was going to be inside of a week-long covenant that was divided in half into a 3.5-year period. And here again, this prophecy is recapitulating the same events with more detail. There was going to be 3.5 years of intense distress, and it would result in breaking into pieces the power of the holy people. That is the sanctuary. And later he tells Daniel, from the time that the continual burnt offering is taken away, that is, when the sacrifice and offering cease, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, which it talks about here, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. And if you do the math on both of these numbers, they both equal about a 3.5-year period. So this is so interesting because these are parallel passages, And he's answering the other angel's question about when would the resurrection of the wicked and the righteous happen. And he's saying from the time that Nero sets up his camps, and there's 3.5 years of distress, and the sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 3.5 years, and in that period, the resurrection will happen, the temple will be destroyed, and Daniel will raise from the dead as well. And this is so powerful, and this is also what Revelation 11 talks about. In Revelation 11, John is told to measure God's temple, and God tells them they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Well, 42 months comes out to 3.5 years. This is talking about the time that they would attack the temple. And this was indeed the Jerusalem temple. It was where their Lord was crucified. You see that a few verses later. And then it talks about how the temple would fall. It says, in that day there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. So after this tribulation period, 1/10 of the city of Jerusalem fell. Now, Daniel Moraes with RevelationRevolution.org did the math on this, and he calculated that the temple and its grounds occupied 1/10 of the space of the city of Jerusalem at that time, which is so powerful. So this was in fact a symbol and a metaphor for the Jewish temple falling. It occupied 1/10 of the city, and when it fell, that 1/10 fell. And at the same moment that that happens, you have the seventh angel sounding his trumpet, and at that moment, the kingdom is established, and it comes time for the dead to be judged, and God's going to destroy those who destroy the earth. So this is the wicked dead, and it's the time of God's wrath. So how powerful is that? These prophecies all align with each other. There was going to be Nero setting up his Roman armies outside of Jerusalem, and then there was going to be 3.5 years of distress where the wicked dead would rise, and the righteous too. And then the temple would fall, and that would mark the end. And Jesus, he prophesied that this would happen in his generation. In Matthew 24, he explicitly points to Daniel. He says, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And he's talking about there's going to be a great distress coming on the land. He says that in verse 21. For then there will be great suffering, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever will be. So this is talking about the same thing that Daniel 12 does, when he talks about a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation, even unto that same time. And he later goes on to say that all of this will certainly happen within their generation. This is so powerful, and Luke tells us more information about this. He says, for these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. He's referring to the writings of Daniel, or all the prophets, and all of them were going to be fulfilled, including the resurrection of the just and of the unjust. And he talks about how Jerusalem would be trampled down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That 3.5 year period that Revelation 11 and Daniel 12 talks about, and Daniel 9. And again, he says this will certainly happen within their generation. Now, notice that Matthew describes an abomination of desolation beginning these days of distress. But Luke describes Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and they should know that its desolation was at hand. Well, Matthew was written to a mostly Jewish audience who they interpreted this as a violation of God's law, something that was abominable. And you can see this with Antiochus Epiphanes in their past, when he marched into Jerusalem with his soldiers and ordered them to do things they shouldn't do. And Luke is writing to a mostly Gentile audience, and in a language that they can understand, and he interprets this abomination of desolation as Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. And this is so interesting, and it leads us into our next subject. How was this abomination fulfilled? When the Roman armies would march into battle, they carried images and banners of their gods and Caesar, which violated, oh my gosh, my program or whatever is adding these. Yeah, I didn't tell it to do that. You can ignore that. Roman legions, they carried these images or banners into battle, and they violated Jewish law because they had depictions of their gods and Caesars on it. And Exodus 24, God tells the Israelites, you shall not make yourself a carved image of any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water underneath the earth. And in previous decades, when the Romans would come near Jerusalem, the Jews would rush out of the city and they would protest to the Romans and tell them, "Don't enter our city. It's unlawful for these images to come near our city." And they were even willing to die to prevent that from happening. And when the Romans saw that, they backed off and in previous decades removed those banners and images. That even happened under Pontius Pilate. And so you see the history for that and how the Jews understood that. So that was an abomination to them to see those banners and those images surrounding Jerusalem. Well, between May and August of 66 AD, Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem, and they didn't pay attention to the Jews. They brought those images into their city. And there was a major attack, and this was right after a number of miraculous events happened at Passover. This is a timeline I created while I was reading The War of the Jews by Josephus, and I created a timeline of all the events that were happening. And around the end of May, we have Florus coming into Jerusalem. He wants to take the gold from the temple, and he kills 3,600 Jews. He even crucifies them. And a few days later, you have the angelic armies seen coming on the clouds. And you have many phantoms appearing with this resurrection event that Josephus records. And I talk about these two things in previous videos. Well, just a few days later, you also have Eleazar, the son of the high priest Ananias. And what he did is he convinced the people who officiated the sacrifices not to accept any sacrifice for foreigners. And this was in violation of God's law, because God told the Israelites, the foreigners, their sacrifices and burnt offerings will be accepted on my altar. And what happened is when Eleazar, when he convinced the priests not to accept sacrifices in the temple from the Gentiles, they also blocked Caesar's sacrifice. And Josephus tells us that this was when the war of the Romans truly began. He says, at that same time, Eleazar, son of Ananias, the high priest, was a very bold youth who was at that time governor of the temple, and persuaded those that officiated in the divine service to receive no gift or sacrifice for any foreigner. And this was the true beginning of our war with the Romans. And this is in Josephus, Book 2, Chapter 17, Section 2. He also said that at the same time, Eleazar seized control of the temple and turned it into his shop of tyranny. So he used it as his fortress for his battle plans and for committing all kinds of sinful acts. So we have here kind of a multifaceted abomination of desolation. The Roman armies marching into Jerusalem with their banners. We have the cessation of the daily sacrifice, with Eleazar convincing the priests not to accept sacrifices from the Gentiles. And we also have him standing in the holy place, like turning the temple into his shop of tyranny. And that marks the beginning of the Roman war. And this, Eleazar convinced them to forbid these sacrifices on August 17th. This is just a rough estimate based on the Jewish date. I don't know how to pronounce that name, but that's the date, on the 6th. And it corresponds, we think, to August 17th or somewhere in there. And that began the 1,335 days mentioned in Daniel, which ended in April 14th, the first day of Passover in 70 AD. And that was the feast in which the Romans surrounded Jerusalem and locked everyone inside so they couldn't escape, and committed to their final siege of the city, that 5-month period during which the temple fell. So that's so powerful because all the elements prophesied in Daniel are there. You have this 3.5 years of distress, basically starting from mid-66 AD to 70 AD. And you have the temple falling at the end of that period. You have the continual burnt offering being taken away when Eleazar convinced the priests not to accept Gentile sacrifices. And you have the Roman abomination being set up at this same time, which, as Luke tells us, that was when the armies surrounded Jerusalem. That was the Roman armies. Wow. So how cool is that? We can see that this literally fulfilled in history, just like Jesus prophesied. Well, not only was the kingdom of heaven about to arrive, and not only was the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked about to happen, but the great white throne judgment was also indirectly stated to occur soon, even sworn to occur soon. Revelation is not meant to be interpreted linearly. It's a series of repeating visions and events. One scholar described it like a spiral where you're seeing the same events from a spiral each time, getting more information about the same series of events. And Revelation is constantly recapitulating things it mentioned earlier and adding more details to it. And we see this in the idea that, for instance, every island and mountain in Revelation is flattened twice. How often can that happen? The earth can't have every island and mountain flattened twice, but it happens in chapter 6 and in chapter 16. And this idea also happens with water turning to blood in chapter 8 and 16, stars falling to the earth in chapter 6, 8, and 12, mounted troops from the Euphrates gathering for battle in Revelation 9 and 16, John's falling at the angel's feet to worship him and being rebuked. That's Revelation 19 and Revelation 22. The marriage of the Lamb, that happens in Revelation 19 and in Revelation 21. God wiping away every tear from the saints' eyes and them never thirsting again. That's Revelation 7 and Revelation 21. Well, just like these other instances, the Great White Throne Judgment is a recapitulation of the seventh and final trumpet mentioned in Revelation 11. This is so powerful, and we're going to compare these passages. Well, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about the resurrection of the dead when death is defeated. So he's talking about the second resurrection. And he says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet." So here Paul is talking about the last trumpet. "For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we will be changed." And he says at the same resurrection, that's when death is swallowed up in victory. And he says, "Hades, where is your victory?" So this final resurrection was going to be the resurrection where the final trumpet is blown and where Hades is defeated. And of course, if you read Revelation 11, you see the seventh angel sounding his trumpet, and that's the final trumpet in Revelation. There's no more trumpets after that. This is the last trumpet that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. And at this time, you have a resurrection of the dead, and not just the righteous, but also the wicked, those who destroy the earth. So you have the resurrection of the wicked dead occurring at this last trumpet. And again in Revelation 20, where you have the great white throne judgment, you also have this resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. And you have death and Hades being thrown into the lake of fire, which is their defeat. Where is their victory? So these two events, these two passages are both talking about the same event. And this is so powerful. Furthermore, when Daniel talks about the book of life in Daniel 12:1, let me open that real quick. Daniel 12. You notice he mentions about the book of life. And that also happens in, let's see here, the book of life right here in Revelation 20. So you see that these kind of two passages about the wicked dead being raised, they correspond to each other. And Daniel also talks about the times and a half of tribulation of 3.5 years. And that also corresponds to Revelation 11, where you have the Gentiles treading the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So you see another way that these two passages are related, just to kind of drive that point home. Well, this is so important because Revelation 10 states that that seventh and final trumpet would occur without any more delay. John was told from the perspective of him writing today that that trumpet would be blown without any more delay. In verse 5, it says, "The angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land lifted up his right hand to the sky and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, and the earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there will no longer be delay. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, then the mystery of God is finished, as he declared to his servants, the prophets." This is so powerful because this is an oath. This is God swearing something. And when God makes an oath, he can never break it. It can never be undone. It would be a sin to break it. So this is an oath that there will no longer be delay. And it had seemed like a delay because the disciples were nearing the end of their generation when they expected these events to occur, and they hadn't occurred yet. And this verse was meant to comfort them that although it had seemed like a delay, God was going to return on time. He is going to return before their generation ended. And that would occur when the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and the mystery of God was finished as he declared to his servants, the prophets. Well, if you recall, Daniel was told to seal the prophecy, to seal the scroll, for it contained prophecies about the distant future. That is, it wasn't meant to be understood at that time. And later, at the final chapter of Revelation, the angel tells John, don't seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. That is, they were meant to understand these mysteries. They were meant to understand this prophecy. And that's what Revelation 10 is saying, that when the seventh angel blew his trumpet, that mystery would be disclosed and everyone would understand that what God meant to Daniel when he prophesied that. That's so powerful because since the Great White Throne Judgment is associated with the seventh trumpet, that means these were both promised to occur without delay. And if we read in Revelation 11 where the seventh angel blows his trumpet, it talks about how the kingdom is given to God, and it talks about how God's wrath came and also the time for the dead to be judged. And this wasn't just the righteous, it was the wicked, because he says, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. So this is the final resurrection, that second resurrection at the end of the millennium, that was sworn to occur without delay. And notice also, right before the seventh angel sounds, the angel tells John, behold, the third woe comes quickly. So he's talking about the last trumpet. That was about to come. That was coming quickly. It would happen without delay. Now, that's one way that the Great White Throne Judgment was stated to occur soon. The other is in Revelation 22. This is the final chapter in Revelation after the Great White Throne Judgment, after the New Jerusalem. And in it, Jesus says, I am coming quickly, and that those who listen to him will enter in by the gates into the city, that heavenly Jerusalem. And so when he says he's coming quickly, he's talking about the Great White Throne Judgment there. And so we have basically three passages now. We got the Revelation 11 one, the third woe coming quickly. We got Revelation 10 talking about the final trumpet occurring without delay and its association with the Great White Throne Judgment. And we have Revelation 22 where Jesus promises his return will be quickly so that they may enter into the city. Wow, that is so powerful. And it shows that the Great White Throne Judgment was indirectly stated and even sworn to occur soon. Well, the Great White Throne Judgment, it corresponds with the defeat of Satan and of death. And this monumental event was promised to occur soon. In Romans 16:20, Paul says, the God of peace will soon crush Satan underneath your feet. And that word crush there, that's reminiscent of a prophecy that God made to Adam and to the snake. And he said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. And this idea was that Christ was going to come, and he was going to crush the head of Satan, the serpent. And this was going to mark his ultimate defeat, which that happens in Revelation 20 when he's thrown into the lake of fire. And this was going to happen when Jesus returned. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 22 through 26, it states, for as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. That's talking about the second resurrection. But each in his own order, Christ the firstfruits, then those who are Christ at his coming. So when Christ returned, that would be the second resurrection. Then the end comes at his return, when he will deliver up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he will have abolished all rule and all authority and all power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death. So when Jesus returned, he was going to abolish Satan and death. And of course, Satan is the ultimate of all of his enemies. He would definitely be included in this. That was the time that he was going to be crushed in fulfillment of God's prophecy to Eve. And that was soon to happen, which also indicated that the ending of death was soon to happen. And I discuss these in more detail in other articles if you care to read them. I hope to make videos on them in the future if you wonder if Satan's still around today or how defeated he actually was. And I also talk about the defeat of death, the defeat of Hades, and what that meant and how it gave us access to heaven. So if you care to understand those articles, go ahead and check them out. I'll try to make videos on them later. But this concludes all of our points. And in summary, we're going to go back through and summarize the things we've said. Basically, Christ was promised to have one return. When he came, he was going to establish the kingdom of heaven. And that was only going to be established once, and it was going to last forever. So each of these returns, it's not talking about separate returns. It's all describing one occasion. Christ would come and he would establish the kingdom. And that was about to happen. He was going to bring his kingdom with him, and that was all going to happen soon. And it repeatedly says it was going to happen soon. And the Christians were expecting that. Even in Hebrews 13, they were expecting the city that was about to come, that New Jerusalem mentioned in Revelation 21. And the second resurrection that happens at that judgment, that was also about to happen. In Acts 24:15 and 1 Peter 4 and 2 Timothy 4, it talks about how this resurrection of the wicked dead was about to happen. The end of all things is near. That's so powerful. And this would all happen before the fall of the temple in that 3.5 years of great tribulation. And Hebrews 9 talks about how the new heaven would be opened at that temple's destruction. And Daniel 12 and Revelation 11 talk about how this second resurrection would happen at the fall of the temple in those years of tribulation. And we talked about what the abomination of desolation meant and the cessation of the sacrifices and how that began that tribulation period. And that happened when Eleazar convinced the priest to not accept Gentile sacrifices. And it happened when the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem and brought their images and banners into the city, which violated God's law and set up that abomination. And that began that tribulation period. And that all happened in Jesus' generation, just as he prophesied in the Olivet Discourse. And we discussed how the Great White Throne Judgment was sworn to occur soon, because the seventh trumpet was sworn to occur soon, and they are parallel passages. And we also talked about how that was supposed to happen quickly. The third woe was supposed to happen quickly, and how the Great White Throne Judgment was talked about in Revelation 22, where Jesus says he is coming quickly to allow them into the gates of the city. And finally, we discussed how Satan was soon to be defeated at the end of that millennium when Jesus returned, and death along with him. This is so powerful because even though the Bible doesn't talk about directly the end of the millennium, it talks about all the events associated with the end of the millennium. The defeat of death, the defeat of Satan, the establishment of the kingdom of heaven, the New Jerusalem, the Great White Throne Judgment, the resurrection of the dead. All of these events were about to happen, and they were sworn to happen soon. And so if the disciples expected that in their lifetime, then that means the millennium was also about to end in their lifetime. And the conclusion here is, if the millennium began at Christ's ascension around 30 AD, and it would end within their lifetime when the temple fell, roughly 40 years later, then a millennium isn't literally 1,000 years. And just as Revelation allows us to do, it was a symbol for a shorter period. And so we're going to be discussing that in the next article. We're going to be looking at what the symbol of the millennium meant and how the first century Jews and rabbis interpreted it. So I hope you stick around for that, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know. And I ask that you pray about these things and you study it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Do your own study and pray that God shows you the truth from these matters. So thank you. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a good day.